Now, I love to listen to true crime videos, campfire stories, and podcasts about the strange, spooky, and sinister, probably more than most, and definitely more than I should. But sometimes your noggin needs a break from all that. So, I decided to tell my own non-scary stories and share them here with all of you. Consider this your safe space to relax, listen, learn, and maybe even drift off to sleep. So settle in, wind down, and cuddle up. And welcome to Non-Crime Storytime. Welcome or welcome back. Come on in. Get comfy. You can close your eyes if you want. And let me tell you a story. This one's called The Legend of Ol' Rip. Born under the sizzling summer skies of 1896, Ol' Rip was a small-town Texas boy destined to become a worldwide legend. But first, he had to die. Even in the first summers of his wild youth, Rip valiantly wandered the West Texas landscape like the cowboy legends of old, basking in the sun of the day and dodging bandits and coyotes by night. People in the nearby towns saw Rip as a dime a dozen, all too familiar remnant of the dusty days of the Old West. Wherever he went, Rip was met with resistance, fear, and discrimination. It was made clear his kind weren't welcome. So he wandered, surviving only on what his beloved Lone Star land could provide. But one day, Rip wandered into a powerful man's territory, a local city politician named Ernest E. Wood. Wood's power-hungry hands captured Rip and locked him in the walls of the Eastland County courthouse in a cold tomb of stone and silent solitude, with only a bit of booze and a Bible to keep him company. Using the outlaw Rip's capture to gain clout in the local city council, Wood saddled up on his high horse and rode into the Eastland sunset, with Rip stuck inside the pitch-black belly of the courthouse, year after year. Now, some folks said it was hogwash, the mythical living ghost of the Eastland County courthouse, and as the years passed, soapbox truth dwindled to whispered legend to nearly nothing at all. 32 long years passed with Rip inside those walls. As he grew shriveled and pale in the lonely darkness, that little Texas town bravely stretched out over highways and train tracks. The long, yawning stretches of telephone lines cut shadows in the dust in time for the ground to start crying oil in mile-high spurts, transforming Eastland from a map dot to a boom town. While Rip was stuck on the inside, the world around him was changing fast. But time was changing Rip, too. For years, he pickled in patience, his skin hardening to rough leathered scales, his nerves into barbed wire, and his jaw welded shut into a chiseled, callous silence. The injustice of his imprisonment weighed like a stone slab upon him, the faint, distant call of his destiny drifting through the dry desert air like a lonely wolf's howl. His spirit nearly broken, Rip's breaths became shallow, and his tired body deflated, ghostly thin and as flat as his bones would lay. Resigning physically, mentally, and emotionally to his bed of cold stone, Ol' Rip felt the approaching dark that only a man with a broken heart would welcome. And in a silent, steely stare, Rip bravely brushed fingertips with death, preparing that he'd long ago seen his last West Texas sunrise. But what Rip didn't know was that while he was locked away, he'd become a legend to the small town of Eastland and beyond. an old Eastland faithful had held on to Rip's story, and at first mention of the county courthouse being demolished for yet another, the town faithful whispered Rip's story to every newspaper willing to hear it. The secret was out. The living ghost of the Eastland County courthouse was real, and he was about to be released after 32 years of lonely captivity. But just who, or what, was going to emerge from those walls remained to be seen. Walking down the dark, cobwebbed corridor, when the city clerk reached Rip's cell, the cold silence made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The echo of jingling keys and the lonely whine of the jail cell door was the only sound to accompany a most regrettable discovery. In a pile of gray skin, dust, and ash, old Rip laid in a lifeless heap. No sound, no movement, no breath. And with only one exit, Wood and his men knew they'd have to show Rip's disappointingly dead body to the world and the eager crowd of nearly 3,000 waiting outside. When Rip finally emerged from the courthouse that February morning, propped up on the shoulders of 2 police officers, crowds cheered and pushed forward to see the legend live and in the flesh. Bewildered, the crowd watched as Rip's feet dragged languidly down the steps, his head bobbing and dangling from his curved, stretching neck, his lungs and mouth clamped grotesquely shut against the finally fresh air around him. Eyes wandered wildly in the crowd as the men dragged Rip through the throng of eager Eastland locals, whose excited murmurs hushed as the lifeless ghost's body passed by each row of speechless onlookers. The crowd's squinted glances traveled from Rip's body to the accompanying men in uniform in poisonous darts. As the disgruntled grumbles and ever-angering prattle grew into a furious roar, Wood and his men stood staggered in disbelief, their clammy hands still struggling to prop up Rip's lifeless corpse. The vibrating mass of angry citizens pointed and shouted at the men, flinging blame and curses as the claustrophobic circle closed in around them from all sides. And just before the men were swallowed by the swarming crowd, everything suddenly stopped. A wave of surprised gasps rushed over the crowd. Rip's leg had just twitched. And now, the rest of the story. On July 29, 1897, a Texas horned lizard was found and captured as a pet in Eastland, Texas, by a young boy named Will Wood, whose father, Ernest E. Wood, was the Eastland County clerk. Will scooped up the small lizard, one of an abundant population at the time, and named him Blinky. Eastland, Texas was a small West Texas town that began growing very quickly in the late 1800s, and its exponential growth didn't stop for nearly a century afterwards. In 1897, the city had just lost its small, humble courthouse to an unfortunate fire, and by the summer of that year, the new courthouse was constructed. The new civic building was scheduled to celebrate its opening and its official cornerstone laying with a big town celebration on July 31st. When the city's plans to include a time capsule in said cornerstone were discussed, Wood came up with what he thought was a great idea. Since the days of the Old West, the Texas horned lizard, colloquially known as the horned frog or simply a horny toad, has been the subject of legend, myth, and curiosity. These small, round lizards are covered with small spikes, with 2 large, sharp spikes crowning their head. But spikes aren't its only defense mechanism. While it sounds like a myth, it's actually true that a Texas horned lizard can shoot blood directly from its eyelids to deter predators and make a quick escape if needed. And with a fact like that, that sounds like a myth, it's not hard to believe that some horny toad myths get confused for facts. It's a long-held Texas tradition and Native American legend that a horny toad can live for 100 years. While the actual life expectancy of a Texas horned lizard is closer to 7 to 8 years in protective captivity, Texans and early natives were of the belief for hundreds of years that this special species was a tried and true survivor and the embodiment of the Wild West's principle of get tough or die. Presumably, the 100-year lifespan myth came from a distorted understanding of reptilian hibernation, or more accurately, brumation, the natural process where reptiles spend cold seasons in a state of extreme or even total immobility. The Texas horned lizard does in fact brumate, but as expected, does so only for the winter. And of course, not for a century. But that didn't stop Ernest E. Wood. At the new courthouse cornerstone ceremony on July 31st, 1897, Wood dropped a small item into the hands of the man assembling the time capsule's contents. The man carefully laid in a few historically significant items like coins, a current newspaper, a bottle of whiskey, a Bible, and now, a Texas horned lizard named Blinky. As the cornerstone was sealed and set into the courthouse wall with mortar and stone, Wood resigned himself to the great possibility that he'd never see Blinky alive again. Surely either he or the toad would croak before the legend was proved true or false. But Ernest E. Wood was dead wrong. Late 19th century life in America was a simpler time, before radio and television made its way into our living rooms and into our everyday routine. 1897 saw the birth of American icons like Amelia Earhart, William Faulkner, and Sidney Bechet, all set to disrupt the social and artistic norms of the oncoming 20th century. And while small towns like Eastland would take a little longer to catch up, the world's bigger cities were witnessing incredible growth and innovation. Europeans were discovering the electron, inventing aspirin, and testing a new concept called the submarine, which would prove destructive and decisive in the oncoming onslaught of World War I. Authors, playwrights, and social leaders were leading conversations on human rights and cultural shifts, and modern concepts like public transit, Freudian psychology, and even the paperclip were being explored and embraced for the first time. But that's not to say America wasn't innovating too. Thomas Edison's kinetoscope was on track to show the first moving pictures. Martha Hughes Cannon took office as the first female U.S. senator, defeating her own husband in the election. And Dayton, Ohio saw the first automobile insurance policies ever issued. Forward-thinking American scientists and inventors were unknowingly preparing our nation for the space race, already studying moons as far as Saturn's, developing rocket prototypes with radio transmitters, and the Wright brothers were tinkering with homemade airplanes in North Carolina. As the century turned, everyone's mind buzzed with the curiosity of what was possible and what miracles the world would show us next. And maybe it was that collective curiosity that inspired Ernest Wood to put Blinky in the time capsule. The Native American myths had never been proven or debunked, and the horned lizard was a West Texas icon. Just imagine the headline, West Texas horny toad defies death, or secret to eternal life found in Eastland. Or maybe Blinky was just an afterthought. Maybe Wood saw the Texas horned lizard as it actually was at the time. A cute little dime a dozen. A cheap road trip souvenir. You could bet every little boy walking around in Eastland had at least one in his pocket, so where's the harm in putting one more in a box? And so, he did. Blinky, the Bible, and the bottle of booze were sealed into the cornerstone of the Eastland County Courthouse on July 31st, 1897. And as the town of Eastland and a tumultuous world evolved, Blinky was, quite literally, left in the dust. The early 1900s saw the entire globe shaken by the artillery shells and atrocities of World War I, and after the cannons finally went quiet, the rapid growth of consumer goods and exorbitant post-war spending, by governments and civilians alike, saw the wide expansion of amenities like electricity, the telephone, the telegraph, and the automobile. Into the 1920s, American life became more convenient and colorful, with the Jazz Age bringing about new and exciting societal norms. Then the whiplash of Prohibition, and its much-celebrated end in 1933. Between 1900 and 1930, Eastland's population quadrupled to over 4,600 inhabitants, with the black stains of oil spouts and asphalt streets paving the path of a 20th century Texas town. Some estimations outside the official census claim Eastland grew to as many as 10,000 people at the time of the 1919 oil boom. Cars began to fill the streets and putter back and forth along the new telephone lines between the town's two banks, First Public Library and High School, and nearby oil-rich towns of Ranger and Desdemona. With all this excitement, it's no wonder that a little lonely lizard slipped everybody's mind. That is, everybody except Ernest E. Wood. Eastland's growth over the last 31 years left the town bursting at the seams and, yet again, in need of a new courthouse. At the mentions of the old courthouse's imminent demolition, Wood went to the papers to resurrect the story of the horny toad sealed inside the cornerstone, and buzz began spreading through the town like wildfire. An official time capsule opening was scheduled for the chilly morning of February 18, 1928, and over 1,000, some say more than 3,000, onlookers awaited the grand reveal. In front of the bustling crowd of thousands, Eugene Day, local oil tycoon and brother-in-law to Ernest Wood, dressed in his finest suit, pulled the marble cornerstone and its enclosed time capsule from its 31-year-long entombment inside the courthouse wall. Walking forward into the crowd, people buzzed and pressed forward for a look at the legend in the making. His hands patiently removed the capsule's artifacts. The unchanged coins jingled in his hands, and the newspaper's dusty shroud erupted a small cloud of ashes into the sky, and a bottle of whiskey, which would soon go missing, clinked and bubbled in its glass encasement. Then, Day's hands moved carefully to Blinky, who lay dry and flat as a pancake. His eyes were closed in a lifeless rest, and his mouth had grown shut from decades without food or water. His skin was a mix of patchy, dusty gray scales, and his body lay completely still. No breath, no movement, no life. As everyone feared, Blinky was dead. Day passed the small, scaly body to Reverend Frank Singleton, who with a shaking head passed Blinky's body to Judge Ed Pritchard. The Eastland County judge raised Blinky's body for the entire crowd to see, and as it hung lifeless by its right leg in front of them, the disappointment and loss of childhood wonder spread through the crowd like a drowsy fever. The silence was nearly deafening. That is, until Blinky's leg twitched. "The darn thing's alive," Judge Pritchard yelled, as Blinky's eyes shot open and his body gave a defiant wriggle, nearly escaping the judge's grasp. And the crowd of thousands jumped into an again hopeful, uproarious applause. It was true. Blinky was dead. But now, Old Rip was born. Named for the fable of Rip Van Winkle by Washington Irving, Old Rip was the new heartbeat of Eastland. The little Lazarus lizard, still referred to by many as a horny toad, became the talk of the town, And that talk spread across the nation after Rip was featured in newspapers, from local Texas publications to the New York Times, and even a visit to Washington, D.C. to meet President Calvin Coolidge. Old Rip fever had taken Texas by storm, and then the nation. The Fort Worth Star-Telegram said Rip was, quote, the most famous reptile since the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Eastland local and Rip revival witness Cecil Funderburg said, Rip got more press coverage than anyone other than Charles Lindbergh when he flew the Atlantic. He was everywhere. But not everyone could get a glimpse of Rip for free, and many people were ready to pay top dollar to get a piece of Rip mania. In 1928, accompanied by a now middle-aged Will Wood, the original owner of Blinky, Old Rip drew a crowd of 40,000 paying spectators, allegedly at 10 cents apiece, to the St. Louis, Missouri Zoological Gardens. A print run of 16,000 Old Rip postcards completely sold out. Rip was even featured alongside Will Wood in a Fox Movietone motion picture featuring Rip doing what he did best, posing still for the cameras and steadily munching on Texas harvester ants. And while Rip's fame and fortune was exciting for the human residents of Eastland and beyond, Rip's fellow lizard compatriots paid the price. After Rip's national publicity, the popularity of the Texas horned lizard as a pet soared, and the lizards were sold, or in some cases given away, at venues spanning from gas stations to the 1928 Democratic National Convention, where for $2.50, or about $45 today, you could have your very own Rip to take home, wherever and however cold and harvester ant free that may be. The Dallas Advertising League even sold 600 lizards at their World Convention, which, unfortunately and unfittingly, took place in Detroit, Michigan. So many horned lizards were captured and exported out of Texas from 1928 to 1935 that zoological, botanical, agricultural, and biological scholars and associations published multiple articles and media warning of the great ecological shift soon to come after the Texas horned lizard's newly assigned endangered status. And unfortunately, they weren't wrong. The Texas horned lizard is still, a century later, a highly protected species in Texas, with even touching one in its natural habitat the subject of a statewide law punishable by a substantial fine. The biggest ecological impact of the early days of Rip mania came when the lizard's main food supply, the harvester ant, with no predators to control the species, ran wild across the area and did irreversible damage to crops used for family and commercial food sources, mechanical processing and export, and even the synthesis of fuels and medicines. Rip fever had spread across Texas and would leave in its wake a record bad crop for years to come. But ants weren't the only controversy that followed Rip's miraculous revival. The tall tale of the Lazarus lizard had some people in a tizzy, debating the big question on the tip of everyone's tongue. Was it true? A top theoretical accusation was, well, how do we know that's the real Rip? Somebody could have replaced it with a live lizard when nobody was looking. With one of the main witnesses and actual proclaimer of Rip's survival, the famed "the darn thing's alive," being the local Methodist minister, the claims of dishonesty had little footing at the time. In fact, in a 1928 Woodville Republican newspaper article, Old Rip's closest eyewitnesses themselves, Judge Pritchard, Reverend Singleton, and Eugene Day, insisted there was no way the toad could have been tampered with, as they held the cornerstone from the moment it was excised to the moment Rip was removed from the capsule. Adding more proof to the pudding, a local businessman gained fame in Eastland for offering children and adults alike a crisp $100 bill, nearly $1,800 today, to anyone who could find and bring him a Texas horned lizard in the month of February, the date of Rip's revival. no one was ever able to claim the money. More scholarly questions read, if he's alive, how did he survive in there? Is it a miracle, science, or a scam? And as most science versus miracle debates are wont to do, it's here that the Rip discussion really got heated. While people outside of Eastland kept the word hoax on their breath, Dr. William T. Hornaday, famous naturalist and curator of the New York Zoological Gardens, postured that it is theoretically possible for a horned lizard to survive an extended brumation such as Rip's, while his neighbor, contemporary and curator for mammals and reptiles for the Bronx Zoo, Dr. Raymond L. Ditmars, decided the story of Old Rip was utterly impossible. Critics in Dothan, Alabama, a city already enamored with Americana and roadside attractions of its own, claimed they had proof of a hoax. After hearing and doubting Rip's story, they themselves sealed a horny toad in a box and buried it for 6 months, only to find out that the lizard died. Accordingly, Dothan proclaimed with a puffed chest that Old Rip was a fraud. However, Eastland's retort fairly argued the facts and discrepancies of their town's miracle. Old Rip hadn't been buried. He'd been entombed, where he could breathe and maybe even get the occasional drip of rain or a pipe leakage for hydration. The science was foggy, but not impossible, and Eastland would be very hard to convince that their own little miracle was anything but true. Rip's owner, Will Wood, and his local religious contemporaries confidently claimed that Rip's survival was solely due to the inclusion of a Bible in the stone. Mostly, Texans decided that any out-of-state skeptic was just suffering from pure jealousy. Despite the arguments, Rip was a legend on the tip of everyone's tongue. By the fall of 1928, Rip was the subject of conversations, newspaper articles, motion pictures, and kitschy merchandise. Still under the care of Will Wood, the once boy owner of Blinky, the man and his lizard returned to Eastland after a whirlwind tour of the nation. Back at home, Rip lived in a sand-filled goldfish bowl, fattening himself on harvester ants and entertaining crowds through the drugstore window. But one night, Will Wood left Rip's bowl outside on the porch, and when an unexpected cold snap blew through the area that night, Rip was taken with pneumonia and died the next morning. Eastland's little Lazarus lizard was dead, for the second and final time, and all that was left to do was to give him a true hero's send-off. Wood demanded only the best for Old Rip's final resting place. He obtained a small, red velvet-lined, glass-topped luxury coffin with brass handles from the Abilene Casket Company. Rip was embalmed, preserving his small but mighty body as it was at his happiest and healthiest, full of fresh air and hometown harvesters. After an open casket wake at the local funeral home, Rip was placed into the sunny vestibule of the Eastland County Courthouse, a huge step up from his previous underground suite, and put on display for mourners and adorers alike to come by and give their regards. Old Rip was dead, this time for good, and it was now Eastland's turn to keep his legacy alive. And they have, with great pride. On May 24, 1936, in one of the title's first ever publications, Ripley's Believe It or Not had a tiny feature dedicated to Old Rip in the Fort Worth Record-Telegram. It seemed that even 7 years after his death, Rip fever may have died down, but his story continued to amaze the nation. In 1949, Eastland began officially honoring Rip with citywide celebrations and events, including the Eastland Old Rip Horned-Toad Derby with "In Memory of Old Rip" inscribed even on the individual paper tickets. Citizens from Eastland and beyond would gather downtown around a chalk-drawn ring, where a handful of horned lizards were corralled in the center. Spectators could place bets on the lizard of their choice, and whichever lizard made its way outside the circle first won a hefty purse of $500 for its better. Still feeding on its slowly dwindling rip, fame, and fever, the Eastland Chamber of Commerce sent letters to stars of the screen, inviting them to visit the town and bet in the races. Pioneer ventriloquist and comedian Edgar Bergen once put a $5 bet on a toad, but unfortunately didn't come away with the victory. Bergen's loss was still a small win for the town of Eastland, whose name, and its resident miracle horny toad, was yet again interjected into the national gossip. And even apart from Rip's name, the Texas horned lizard had not left the culture of kitschy Americana just yet. At the 1950 National Scout Jamboree in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, eager Texas scouts arrived with pockets full of horned toads that they excitedly, but unfortunately, traded with other scouts from northern states. Also during this time, Texas was seeing a major expansion of its paved roads, which cut hot, lizard-enticing asphalt and dangerous high-speed traffic through the Texas horned lizard's most populated territories. Between the changing landscape and ravenous pet trade demand, the species was disappearing. In 1958, an interviewed pet dealer claimed that he had sold 500,000 fewer horned lizards than the previous year, owing to their drastically dwindling population. Modern herpetologist and current head of the Horned Lizard Conservation Society, Bill Brooks, stated most poignantly, "They were collected to death." But nothing could kill the spirit of Ol' Rip, not even the endangerment of his species. In 1955, Warner Brothers released a new animated cartoon on its Merry Melody series with a very familiar plot. In One Froggy Evening, a sad, droopy-faced frog is discovered, locked inside of a box that's sealed within the cornerstone of a city landmark. But soon upon his discovery, the frog springs to life, donning a Cary Grant-inspired top hat and cane, and sings, dances, and performs acrobatic tricks with incredible energy and charisma. The character who found the frog plans to make millions off of his amphibian marvel, who he names Michigan J. Frog. The story goes on to warn of the dangers of greed and exploitation of others, as the frog's talents are revealed to only be visible to the one who possesses the box, thwarting the finder's plans of national fame and fortune. While no official statement has been made in support or denial of Ol' Rip's influence on Michigan J. Frog, those familiar with the legend of Ol' Rip can understandably draw striking parallels. But back in real life, in 1961, the population of the Texas horned lizard in Eastland dropped again, this time by a very important number: 1. Upon entering the courthouse on Wednesday, September 27, 1961, a city employee noticed something odd. In the echoing, empty vestibule of the just unlocked courthouse, Rip's casket lid was inexplicably open, and Rip was inexplicably absent. After 33.5 years of peace, just slightly more time than he'd spent in the time capsule, Ol' Rip had been lizard-napped. Rip's body was gone, and a ransom note was left behind, demanding $10,000, over $100,000 today, for his safe return. While local citizens and authorities went on the hunt for Rip, the perpetrators entered the courthouse unseen for a second time and left an additional note, as well as a very much alive Rip replacement in the casket. The note read, "Don't worry, folks, I just stepped out for coffee." Local police expected it to be a prank, but treated the matter of their town's greatest tourist attraction in peril very seriously. The sheriff of Eastland soon became suspicious of the local Junior Chamber of Commerce members whose big fundraising event could use a good publicity stunt. When the sheriff paid the Jaycees president Grover Hallmark a visit, Hallmark was quoted as saying, "We definitely had no part in the frog-napping of Ol' Rip," then casually tacking on to the end of his official statement, "But I won't be responsible for the actions of the individual club members, though." Within a few hours, an anonymous phone call to the city pointed authorities to an unharmed Rip nestled in a paper bag in room 400 of the Eastland National Bank building. The lively Rip stand-in was presumably freed, and Rip's still body set back to rest in his cozy coffin. But within a year, Rip's peace would be again disturbed for the sake of publicity. On his 1962 gubernatorial whistle-stop tour, future Texas Governor John Connally hopped off the campaign trail in Eastland to take a look at Ol' Rip up close and personal. Posing for a photo with the lizard, Connally allegedly lifted Rip from his casket by his left hind leg, only to have the fragile, embalmed leg snap off in his hand, with Rip free-falling onto the courthouse's marble floor. The now 3.5-legged Rip was immediately and carefully returned to his velvet resting place. In 1965, H.V. O'Brien Jr. penned a book entitled The Story of Ol' Rip, which was a literary celebration of Eastland and its legendary lizard. The book introduced Eastlanders to the Ol' Rip Oath, which would survive through the decades as a proud promise to spreading, defending, and preserving the story of Ol' Rip. With the continued assistance of the people of Eastland County who also hold these truths, I do solemnly swear that I will do all in my power to help perpetuate the truth of Ol' Rip. So help me God. O'Brien's book also alleged that a small group of young Eastlanders camped out at the partially demolished courthouse back in 1928 to make sure no quote-unquote hanky-pank happened with the cornerstone before it was exhumed. And with that, another voice came forward to protect the integrity of Rip and Eastland. In the 1930s, the Texas horned lizard faced a new villain, the red fire ant. Over the next 3 decades, the fire ant population in Texas grew so that the state saw the greatest drop-off in Texas horned lizard population from 1960 to 1970, greater than the decimation during Rip Mania. These invasive insects damage crops and wreak havoc on other insects, the harvester ant in particular. The Texas horned lizard's primary food source was being viciously attacked, and the only way to treat these ants at the time was with pesticides that unfortunately would also kill the harvester ant, and accordingly, the horned lizard itself. But in the blame game, humans were by no means off the hook. The pet trade was still in full swing, with many children still collecting the lizards they could find, even shipping them to customers and collectors as far as New York in exchange for nickels apiece. Enough at the time for a summer day's ice cream scoop, candy bar, or movie ticket. In 1967, the Texas government passed a statewide law to protect the collection, export, and sale of the Texas horned lizard, and in just 10 years' time, the species would find itself officially on the threatened species list. Now, anyone tampering with the animal, even little barefoot boys in overalls, would have the authorities to answer to. In 1972, Rip, and the newly coined word toad napping, was back in the local papers, and this time with a story even more mysterious than before. Rip and his casket had been taken from the Eastland County courthouse again, under the cover of night. However, this search ended quickly when Rip's remains were found at the local fairgrounds due to an anonymous tip. Unharmed, Rip's coffin had a note attached. On top of asking for a small monetary ransom, the writer's demands were very different than before. The writer claimed to have been a co-conspirator in the 1928 quote-unquote hoax of Ol Rip's resurrection, and he was now demanding that the other conspirators come forward to admit their part and officially debunk the legend. But again, no one did. The stolen casket was returned to the county courthouse and again put on display, but Eastland locals couldn't help but notice a slightly altered appearance, soon filling the town with one whispered question. Is this the real Rip? 3 years later, the debate's still a hot topic. An angry Eastland citizen wrote to the local newspaper that they, the self-proclaimed true culprit of Rip's 1973 toad napping, still had the real old Rip in his possession, and rather than demanding a ransom, offered a reward of $5,000 to anyone who could prove that the lizard in the courthouse was the real old Rip. The angry citizen's note complained, "The city of Eastland is building its future around a dried-up horned frog, doing his best to tear the lizard legend and Eastland's entire Rip-centric community apart." But the miracle of Ol Rip and the spirit of the town weren't represented or fazed by the complaints of one angry, alleged lizard napper. And in step with Eastland's past treatment of Rip skeptics, no one ever came forward to claim the $5,000, or the supposed second Rip. Since the two historic toad napping incidents, Eastland County has upped their security around Ol Rip's remains, enclosing him safely in more protective casings that ensure any and all visitors can look, but Rip's body will forever lay in peace, protected by the trusted solitary key holder, the Eastland County Court judge himself. Today, there are only a few in Eastland who question the legend or doubt that the beloved 3.5-legged lizard lying in state in the courthouse is the real Ol Rip. The town's culture practically revolves around the lizard, which boasts a yearly festival and parade, a giant metal statue inside Rip's namesake park and plaza, and even an updated derby where, out of respect for the species, the lizards are now replaced with remote-controlled toys, which are decorated and dressed as the hero himself. Rip Fest brings tourists from all over the world to visit Eastland, and the 1984 televised version of Ripley's Believe It or Not, hosted by Jack Palance, paid Eastland a quick visit to see and tell the tale of the town's most famous citizen. The state of Texas as a whole has moved on from the destructive side of horny toad fever and into more proactively protective measures inspired by the Texas horned lizard. In 1990, the Horned Lizard Conservation Society was founded, and in 1993, the species was officially recognized as the state reptile. Each year, Texans may choose the specialty Texas horned lizard commemorative license plate to donate directly to conservation efforts. In the 21st century, Ol Rip has made a few trips to oddity fairs and state-centric celebrations, including a residence at Six Flags Over Texas, where he was displayed as a proud Texas artifact with other eye-catching curiosities like Killer, the world's largest armadillo statue, and the world's largest fruitcake, which is, of course, in the shape of the state of Texas. When transported to Arlington for the exhibit, Eastland's county court gave Rip a proper going-away ceremony, with city employees standing in as pallbearers, who carried Rip's tiny casket into a full-sized hearse before a full police escort ushered him out of town and into the safety of his new temporary home under the flags. Today, Rip is back, resting peacefully in Eastland, and each year the town around him continues to grow stronger in the belief that, with a good soul, a strong heart, and an unbreakable will, death itself is no match for the tried and true Texas spirit. If you want to donate or volunteer to help the Texas horned lizard, visit sazoo.org/donate to send your support directly to the Texas Horned Lizard Reintroduction Project at Center for Conservation and Research at the San Antonio Zoo.